A contrast to this morning's topic in the horror and terrible tragedy of going to heaven and thinking you're going to stay there because you think you're a Christian, and then God says to me, or says to you rather, "Depart from me, I never knew you." What a contrast to the choir of angels when someone gets saved. Two spectrums, aren't they? Joy and tragedy. Proverbs chapter 21 is where we're going to be tonight. Tonight will be much more counseling than preaching like this morning. Do pray for the message this morning. It's done and over with, right? Not in today's day and age. We put that on the World Wide Web, and you never know who's going to listen to that, watch that, and be confronted with their faith or their lack thereof. But there were three people I was praying for specifically to be here this morning, and they were not here, which was heartbreaking and disappointing. But you just never know what God has in store for folks. Still in the Bible. Eternal. So you never know how God will get it to them. Proverbs chapter 21. By the way, we'd be foolish to think that just because we're all in a Baptist church that nobody's that person we read about. A lot of kids grow up in Baptist churches, say a prayer, live the rest of their life doing things for Christ, but still never met Christ. That's a tragedy. That's why we don't push kids here. If a child shows an interest in getting saved, I err on the side of caution. It's always best to err on the side of caution. Well, they might not get saved. Holy Spirit can work that thing out. We'll just let time play out, let the Lord use that. Now, I got saved at the age of 4. And over the years, I said, is it possible? Can I really get saved at the age of 4? Because I certainly didn't understand all the intricacies of salvation. But over the years, there's been no doubt in my mind I met Christ when I was a 4-year-old. The reason being is God never told us to understand the gospel. He told us to believe the gospel. And when I was a little child, I didn't understand everything, but I understood enough to believe what the Bible said. And so for me, it took. But I can't assume everybody's like that. Pastor Phil, you were 5 years old. Pastor Phil is 5 years old. And a lot of you were probably that young as well if you grew up in church. But then there are other testimonies who are going to say, yeah, I was that old. I just said a prayer. And so I realized as a teenager or as a young adult that I wasn't saved. And so we've just got to entrust the Lord to work in each person. Amen? Proverbs chapter 21, unfortunately, we have this terrible habit of making people feel unwanted, unappreciated, and unloved. And what I think is even more unfortunate is that we tend to make our loved ones feel this way. Of all the people in our life that sometimes we can give them the impression they're not wanted, or they're not appreciated, or they're not loved, we can do that to our own spouses, to our children, to our parents, to our siblings, and any number of different family relationships. Making someone feel that way is obviously not a recipe for relationship success. Nor is it God's desire for us to do that to anyone. There are a lot of ways to break a relationship. There's a lot of ways to stop or impede intimacy in a relationship. But I think this idea of making someone feel unwanted, is perhaps the most common ways to slowly starve a relationship that will eventually lead to its demise. Spouses who feel fundamentally unwanted, unappreciated, and unloved will slowly shut down and often shut out their spouse. Children even who feel unwanted, unappreciated, or unloved slowly harden their heart towards their parent or parents, and eventually, if not repaired, will walk away from that biological bond. Because the human spirit can be so sensitive, and it can it? It doesn't take much to make somebody feel this way. More importantly and more concerning, though, tonight is that it doesn't take much for someone to create this feeling in their loved one. It's relatively easy to give someone the impression that they don't mean that much to us. It's relatively easy to make someone feel unwanted. It's pretty easy to make someone feel unappreciated. It's easy to say or do something that makes someone feel unloved. And all that needs to be done to create this sentiment in a loved one is to become self-centered. Self-centeredness is very easy for all of us. It's perhaps the easiest vice of humanity, universally, men and women alike. I will say this, and I just ask that you think about this. Don't necessarily debate me on this, but I don't believe self-centeredness is the same as selfishness. Close siblings, but not the same. Selfishness is serving self. It's feeding self whatever it wants. That's selfishness. Self-centeredness is a little different. It's a little more intellectual. It's focusing on self, but not necessarily feeding self. Self-centeredness is putting self's perspective at the center of everything. Selfishness is giving self everything. They are slightly different. The only reason I point that out is because I don't see an enormous amount of selfishness in churches. And the reason I don't think we see a lot of selfishness is because this is the drumbeat of Christianity, self-denial. Jesus said, if you want to be my disciple, you have to take up your cross, deny yourself, and follow me. And I think any dedicated Christian is aware of that and works hard at not feeding self. Self-centeredness, though, is, I think, very common in Christianity. Reason being is it's hard to detect, and once it gets into our life, we don't see it. Why do I think we have a lot of self-centeredness among us? Because a lot of us have to be right. And a lot of us will never be wrong. That's self-centeredness. This idea that I've got to prevail on any given discussion, argument, debate, or opinion. Possessing unmovable opinions, possessing strong opinions that have to win is a sign of self-centeredness. Now, how many of us does that describe? How many of our spouses does that describe? I mean, listen, you don't have to be married too long to say to the other person, you always have to be right, don't you? No, you always have to be right. And then this never-ending snowball of, no, you do, and you just, fine, you can be right. Oh, there you go. You know, it's just how we are. And I would guess most of us in this room tonight who've been alive for any length of time have been accused of this by our spouse. If you're not married, how about by your sibling, right? Why is self-centeredness hard to identify and hard to combat? Well, I had you turn to Proverbs 21. I want you to see just a phrase. I want you to see it with your eyes. Verse 2 of chapter 21. The Bible says this, every way of a man is right in his own eyes. Period. Just stop right there. Soak that in. Every way of a man, and ladies, don't assume this is talking about just men. This is every way of a man or woman. Every way is right in our own eyes. We always think we're right. We always think we're doing the right thing. We always think we're thinking the right thing. When someone confronts us, our initial instinct in the flesh, our humanity says, well, I'm right and you're wrong. It's just how we all are. That's humanity 101. We're inherently self-centered. We naturally think we're right. And not only do we think we're right, but we think we're right in every way. And you don't get up in the morning assuming you do things wrong. You know you have flaws. But you don't get up in the morning and think, I brushed my teeth the wrong way. No, the way you do it's the right way. The way you floss your teeth is the right way. The way you shower is the right way. The way you eat is the right way. Because you look around at everyone else and you say, why do you eat like that? You're assuming they're wrong, right? The first instinct isn't, I must be eating wrong because they're doing it different. No, it's always, look at them. It's every way of a man is right in his own eyes. That's just who we are. We have to accept that. And because of that, we struggle allowing anyone else to be right. This is one of the greatest plights of a Bible teacher or a Bible preacher. We are supposed to be right? We're teaching the Word of God, and we can't be, I think I'm wrong on this one, but anyways, turn to your Bibles too. We have to get this right because people are listening. Well, that's an issue because we're not always right. And when someone says, hey, preacher, you're wrong, what's my instinct? Of course not. I've never been wrong. That's why I'm a pastor. Pastors are right. You're sitting there and you're wrong. Well, we have to be willing to stop being so self-centered and realize, oh, wait a minute, there's 7 billion minds in this world. Maybe one of them has it right. Maybe I'm wrong on this one. When we're always right, or when we always have to be right, we make our loved ones feel unwanted, unappreciated, and unloved. Again, this is why I said the only thing that needs to be done to create this terrible feeling in a loved one is to be a self-centered person. I worked with a guy at Everfab. His name was Louis the Gooch. Great, great guy. Italian dude, as you can tell. And just had a great attitude in life, a lot of laughter, a lot of good jokes. And I just started there, got to know him, and he told me he was divorced. And you know me, I'm always investigating and always prying. And instead of just saying, well, I'm sorry to hear that, I said, what happened? That's what I do. And he wasn't threatened, because I'm not a very threatening person, as you can see, but he told me, and I will never forget what he said, because it was hilarious, howbeit a sad situation. He says to me, all seriously, he says, Kev, you know how, and I wish I could talk like him, because he's got it. You know how the sun is the center of the universe, and the stars and the planets all revolve around the sun, and the earth revolves around the sun? I said, yeah. He says, no, they don't. No, they don't. You see my ex? Everything revolves around my ex. And he just had me in like he was going to enlighten me about some scientific truth, and he just no, my ex is the center of the universe. Didn't work out, Kev, because she was the center of everything, self-centered. And it just didn't work out for him. I didn't pry anymore. I wasn't sure I could handle the scientific lessons he was going to offer me, but I got it. She was a very self-centered person. But husbands and wives alike withdraw from marriages where these people exist, because after a while, it gets real old dealing with someone who always has to be right. In this case, the losing spouse, and by losing, I mean losing the argument day after day, it just gets old. And why bother? My opinion doesn't matter. What I say doesn't matter. You don't need me, and so I'll move on. We can all relate to that, I'm sure, in some way or another. Nothing makes a person feel more unwanted than being in a relationship with someone who always wins. Being in a relationship where their perspective doesn't matter. In couples, it's easy for us to identify this, but I've got to point out it's also a problem for parents. Now, children, because their parents will be right most of the time, often struggle with feeling unwanted. And this is hard for us as parents to appreciate, because now that we're parents, we forget what it's like to be a child. But when you are engaged in a conversation, and the older you get as a child, the conversation should be a dialogue, not just a lecture. And when that child is always wrong by the parent's words, eventually the child feels that way. Like, why should I even bother explaining myself? I'm going to be wrong anyways. And I'm not saying that in any way a parent should tailor to that, but a parent needs to recognize that it's a challenge, because parents are going to be right most of the time, if not all the time. And children, because their parents possess the right to be right, often wrestle with feeling unappreciated. And so we, moms and dads, have the difficult task of making our children feel wanted, desperately wanted, while consistently pointing out their shortcomings, their foolishness, and their erroneous thinking. That's not easy to do, because we're the ones to say, wrong, nope, that's wrong, you shouldn't do that, stop it. We're constantly pointing out the bad things, and it's very easy to make those children feel unwanted, unappreciated, unloved. Those children grow up insecure. Insecure children are destined for big problems in life, destined for big problems in family relationships. Those are the children who feel unwanted and who feel their place in the home means nothing. That's why I say it's just so easy to give someone this impression. It's so easy to make someone feel that they don't matter. And we have to combat that by making sure we're not allowing ourselves to be self-centered. So turn to Esther chapter 4. We'll park here in Esther. We will go to 1 Peter in one instance, but we'll be parking in Esther. We're back to Esther and King Ahasuerus. Maybe aside from Genesis, Esther is my second favorite book of the Bible to go to for marital and family counsel. It's a great, great book. I believe God chose a pagan prince, a pagan king, and his Jewish wife to teach us many important lessons on relationships. Yes, it's a unique relationship, so we have to be careful to draw too many similarities to it. He was the king, she was the queen. But nonetheless, there's a lot of nuggets to withdraw from that mind. In Esther chapter 4, this is when Haman's plan is revealed to the Jewish people. And Mordecai, who is the adopted father of Esther, he gets wind of this. He goes out into the middle of the city. He cries with a bitter and exceeding cry. Everyone hears him. He then puts on sackcloth and ashes. He goes to the king's gate, and he falls down before the king's gate, which you don't do. If you have sackcloth and ashes, you do not come to the king's gate. So word gets to Esther, who's in the palace, that, hey, your daddy's down by the king's gate in sackcloth and ashes. And she says, you serious? Mordecai is? All right, quick, take these clothes, take them down, tell him to put them on, and stop it. Because we can't be doing this. So he could be arrested. Maybe he'll lose his life. Our name could be a problem. So when the clothes come to Mordecai, Mordecai says to the messenger, attack, take him back to Esther. Evidently, she hasn't heard what's happened. And this give and take takes place between Mordecai and Esther through the messenger. And we get down here in verse number 10 after Mordecai reveals the plan of Haman, the plight of the Jews, and he tells the queen to go convince the king, who is her husband, to reverse the law. Look at what Esther says in verse 10. And Esther spake unto Hatach and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. She says, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death. I did not notice that till reading it now. It says there is one law of his. It's a reference to the king. This is his law. There is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. So we'll stop there. Make sure you understand what she said. Mordecai says you need to go in to your husband, tell him to reverse the law now. She says, you know I can't just walk in unto the king in the inner court. He hasn't called me for 30 days. I haven't seen him. If I walk into the inner court, there's a law in place. He put that law in place. And it says, I will be killed unless he holds the golden scepter. And if he holds the golden scepter, my life is spared and I can go talk to the king. But that's a risky move. I don't know if he's upset with me. He hasn't called me in 30 days. What I want you to see in this passage is a very special truth about Esther. And it's our first point. Number one, it matters what their being husband, wife, children, parents, whatever. It matters what their frame of mind is. It matters what their mindset is. It matters what their thoughts are. Esther, when she got the news about her people being destroyed in short time, she didn't say, I'm going to march into the king and I'm going to tell him he made a bad law. She didn't say, I don't care what he says. I don't care about this stupid law he's got. I'm his wife. I have the right to go in and talk to him. I have the right to tell him he did something wrong. It's not what she does here. She recognizes that her husband is the king of the land, and because he's the king, he has a certain mindset. It's respect. It's respect the parameters of the king. Doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. Doesn't matter if you're my son, my father, my brother, my wife, my child. You can't just come in when you want. If you come in when I did not call you, you're interrupting my responsibilities as king, and I have the right to put you to death. Now, how many of you think that's ridiculous? I think that's ridiculous. Okay? I think, ladies, if your husband's the king, you have the right to walk in and say hi to him at your leisure, and you shouldn't have to wait for the golden scepter. But Esther didn't at all look down upon this law or disregard this law or say it's ridiculous and it has no place in here and my husband's lost it and my husband's full of himself and my husband's this, that, and the other thing. She says, listen, my husband's got this law. I'm conscious of this law. I'm aware of this law. I respect this law. I regard the things that he has put in place. Even in her crisis, where her people were going to die, including her father, she accepted the way her husband thought. Look at verse 12. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words. Mordecai commanded to answer her, Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Verse 15. Then Esther bade return Mordecai this answer, and she said, Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And she says, And if I perish, I perish. Do you sense this, even in her moment of crisis, this level of appreciation and respect for her husband's mindset? She's not just saying, you know what, I don't care about that law. This is a serious moment, and you're going to hear me out. And don't worry, Mordecai, he won't do anything to me when I'm done with him. She says, he's got this law. If he puts me to death, so be it. Verse 1, Esther chapter 5. Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the king, or over against the gate of the house. You may not see it, but I see a woman who, in such a time as this, still acknowledged that her husband had a certain way of thinking, and he had a law he was going to hold to, regardless of the times. And she said, I'm going to go in respectfully, acknowledging that law, and hoping he holds out the golden scepter, and I'm going to put on my royal clothes. And I'm going to take 3 days and pray and fast. I want you to do the same thing. And as I approach the king, I'm not going to tell him, don't even think about holding that golden scepter up to me. We got to talk, and we got to talk now. Now, she went in there very, very conscious of the way that he thinks. Knowing what her husband would think of her unsummoned appearance mattered to Esther. Knowing what her husband would think about her inappropriately dressed appearance mattered to Esther. Knowing what her husband would think about her unapproved approach to the throne, it mattered to Esther. She thought about how much her husband's job impacted his mindset. She thought about how her husband viewed his position as king of 127 provinces. She thought about what would have gone through his mind if she did something to violate one of his laws publicly. You know, what you're not thinking about probably right now is she's aware of what happened to the wife before her. Vashti, remember, wouldn't come into the king's presence, publicly humiliating him, and the king divorced her. She was sensitive to the fact that if another wife, the new wife that he loved, totally disregarded his law that was universal for the land, that it would be another public humiliation. She was sensitive to that. She was aware of that. And what I'm saying in this passage is it mattered to Esther what her husband thought. Had she just marched in there with whatever clothes she wanted and whatever way she wanted at any time she wanted, don't you think it would have caused a relationship problem? Don't you think it would have caused him a problem with all of the people watching? Now the king is going to be partial, maybe, to his subjects, to the people in the land. He was the king. He was who he was. This is an excellent example of one spouse respectfully considering the mindset of another spouse, even when it may be of the extreme side of things. It mattered to her. Even if it was ridiculous, it mattered to her. Ladies, your husband's frame of mind may be ridiculous to you, but it needs to matter if you are to develop a relationship with your husband that he will stay in, that he will invest in, and that he will cherish. Guys, Your wife's frame of mind, the way she thinks, may be ridiculous to you. But if you're going to make her feel wanted, appreciated, and loved, it needs to matter to you. You need to appreciate the way she thinks. Ahasuerus' mindset in the text was shaped by Persian tradition and by incredible responsibility. I want you to think about your spouse if you're married. The way your spouse thinks has been shaped over time by the way they were brought up, by their gender, by their experiences, by their personalities, by their occupation, by failure, and by success. Your spouse's mindset may not be yours, but it needs to matter. And listen to me when I say this. Your spouse's mindset may not be right, but it still needs to matter. Turn to 1 Peter chapter 3. We'll get there in just a moment. Remember, if you have to be right all the time, you'll give your spouse the impression that their mindset doesn't matter, it doesn't count for something, and as a result, because of that secondary unneeded feeling, they'll begin to shut down and shut you out. If you give your spouse the impression that their thoughts don't matter, if you give them the impression that their thoughts are ridiculous, you'll be jeopardizing your marriage. This topic is so important, it's so relevant for marriage because men and women fundamentally think differently, don't we? Fundamentally, we see the world in two different ways. Guys, just because your world doesn't look pink doesn't make it wrong, just makes it different. And ladies, just because when you look at something and your thought is pink and a guy's way is blue, it doesn't make him wrong, it just makes him different. I have written down in my notes this. So many couples make the mistake of spending the rest of their lives convincing the other person in the marriage that they're wrong. Hasn't worked yet, has it? I see couples who've been married 20, 30, 40 years still engaging in this debate of who's right and who's wrong. Maybe it's just different. It matters to your spouse if they think a certain way, and it ought to matter to you. So I'm going to address some hate mail. Can I do that? It's not. I don't get hate mail, but word gets back to me. I don't know if you know this. I have all kinds of little informants in the church. But, a few months ago, I preached a message called Easy Peasy. Remember that message? And I made some comments that evidently some ladies didn't like. And I say plural, okay? And I understand it. I expected it to poke a few buttons, but I made the comment that, ladies, it's not hard to keep your house clean and organized if your husband wants that. I love it. I'm just watching these ladies out there like, oh, preacher, you just don't know. And if you were in my house and lived with, I know, you're just like, I want to tell him what, he just thinks it's so easy. I know what you're thinking. I'm not stupid. I may look young, but I'm not stupid. But what I was saying is it's not difficult to organize and to clean things up if your husband wants you to. Well, that's just so sexist. We don't live in that time anymore. I work and he can clean up too. And how dare the pastor relegate us to cleaning and organizing the house? Oh yeah, it's go time. It's Sunday night. But the fact that some of you, and probably most of you, just because you won't say it, most of you didn't like hearing that, underscores why we're having this conversation. Ready? It's important to your husband. Period. That's all should matter. If your husband thinks that the siding should be pink, and that's the way he thinks, then you know what you should do, ladies? Respect that opinion and say, okay, that's the way you think. Instead of, who does he think he is? How dare he tell me I've got to clean my house and organize it? It's important to him. It's the way he thinks. Now, ladies, let me help you with understanding the mindset of a man. If your husband came into the house and told you where to move the couch, What are your thoughts on that? Or I wish that picture, you know what, honey? Take that picture and put it on that wall. While you're at it, I want new colors in this room. Get that flowery junk off, and I want a little more Joanna Chip Gaines stuff going on, all right? Shiplap tonight, right? How would you feel, ladies? Get your paws off my house. It's my house. I do the decorating, right? You do. You're better at it than guys. We don't decorate. We don't have a total view of it like you do. We're fine with you decorating. You ladies do a great job. It's your house, the queen of the castle. It's how most men think. So if it's your castle, we're going to assume you're the one responsible to clean and organize it. You see, as a guy, we can't do both. Boy, this is like, wow, there are eggshells all over the place. Guys, aren't you happy I'm explaining this for you so you don't have to? In other words, if we said, all right, then I'll take over the house. I'll clean it, organize it, I'll decorate it. Oh, no, you won't. Well, whose is it? Because if I start organizing, you'll get in the way and say, don't, you're messing everything up. So in our minds, it's, all right, you want the house, it's fine. We just would love to come home and be organized and clean. That's how most men think. You don't have to like that. You can claim us, you can call us Neanderthals. You can accuse us of being sexist. You can say whatever you want. But that's the mindset. So what I'm asking you to do is respect that. Acknowledge that. It needs to matter to you because that's the frame of mind your husband has. Now, you can pray for it to change. You can sit down and talk about that, whether that's realistic or not or ridiculous, but you need to have some level of respect for that. The fact that you would even struggle with that shows me that maybe you don't have a respect for a man's mindset. Now, that's just one example of the hate mail that may have come in. Guys, oh my goodness, guys. Your wife has a bazillion of these things that we have to respect. Well, she's crazy, Pastor. She's insane, man. You don't understand. That's her mindset. It may not be right, it may not be sane, but that's her mindset. Now, you can disregard it, and you can tell her you're nuts, woman. What are you doing, though? Making her feel what? Unwanted, unappreciated, unloved. You don't matter, woman. You think crazy thoughts. You're not right. You're secondary. Me? Oh, I'm right. Me? Oh, I'm smart. Oh, I'm the one that's thinking clearly. You see the self-centeredness? Ladies, you're doing the same thing on the other side of it. That's why I have to bring it up to help you. So let me ask these questions before we read 1 Peter chapter 3. Gentlemen, do you make your wife feel like her thoughts do not matter? Does your wife have to think just like you in order to feel relevant in the marriage? And then ladies, do you make your husbands feel like their thoughts don't matter? Does your husband feel like he has to agree with you on everything to be relevant in the marriage? 1 Peter chapter 3. Let's read a few verses here in this passage, and then we'll come back to Esther chapter 7. 1 Peter chapter 3 comes right after, context is everything, comes right after instruction at the end of chapter 2, dedicated to submission. Peter talks about citizens submitting to government, employees submitting to employers, and even if that involves cruel authority. 1 Peter chapter 2 talks about Christ being the ultimate example of submitting to sinful Romans. Verse 1, it starts with likewise. See, it points back to chapter 2. Likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to, what are the next three words? Someone say it nice and loud. Your own husbands. Stink bomb. Your own husband. Yeah, but he's not like, doesn't say submit to your husband when he's like somebody else. Yeah, but if he would just follow the pastors, doesn't say anything about anyone else. Ladies, you're to be in subjection to your own husbands. It's an important important thing here, because your own husband has a unique perspective. Boy, I wish he would think like so-and-so. I wish he'd think like Pastor Phil. I wish he'd think like Andy Smaz. I wish he'd think like, nobody thinks like your husband. His unique mindset matters, and you're to be in subjection to your own husband. So he says be in subjection to your own husbands, but what if he's not right? Oh boy. That if any obey not the word, they also may without the word be won by the conversation of the wives. Well, I don't have to respect him. I don't have to think about his mindset if he's not saved, right? Or if he's not walking with God. Be in subjection to your own husbands. Verse 2. While they, your own husbands, behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear, whose adorning let it not be that outward adorning of plaiting the hair, and of wearing of gold, or of putting on of apparel, but let it be the hidden man of the heart, in that which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. Now, what we learn in this brief passage is, ladies, your individual husband, whether he's a good guy or a bad guy, a saved guy or a lost guy, a guy walking with the Lord or not walking with the Lord, whoever your husband is, you're to be in subjection to him, you're to respect him, and you're to do so with a meek and quiet spirit because God values that. And Peter points out, listen, ladies, it's not about plaiting your hair. It's not about putting on beautiful clothing. It's not about wearing jewelry, because guys are not going to be won over by how you look. You say, wait a minute, that's how I got my husband in the first place. Yes, that's how you got him, but that's not how you keep him. Men are very sight-oriented. We love to see beautiful wives. We love to have our wives looking good. We're much more sight-oriented than women are. That being said, one of the greatest mental mistakes that wives make is that as long as they look good, their husband will be happy. And that's just not true. Men want desperately a good personality in their wives before they want anything else. And Peter mentions that here. And then he says in verse 5, for after this manner in the old time, the holy women also who trusted in God. You say your husband's a bum. Trust in God. Adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands. Even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters ye are, as long as you do well, and are not afraid with any amazement. So that's for ladies. Verse 7, Peter goes on to say, likewise. We're talking about submission, men. Likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge. Guys, you got to learn what your wife's mindset is. And you can't learn what her frame of mind is if you're constantly telling her she's wrong. If you're constantly shutting her down. If you're constantly saying you're crazy, your frame of mind is all mixed up. I know right. I'm the smartest one in this marriage. I've got it all figured out. I am the king of this house. You can't dwell with your wife according to knowledge if you're so self-absorbed, so self-centered. Peter says, giving honor unto the wife. Well, if you're going to honor someone, you've got to give them room to speak and give them an opportunity, a platform to have their voice be heard, and you're going to appreciate that. Giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. So with those verses in mind, let's read verses 8 through 12 and understand that marital conflict is so often over differences of opinion, differences of perspective. Battle over who is right ensues then. In verse 8, Peter says, finally, in light of all this, be ye all of one mind, having compassion one of another, love as brethren, be pitiful, be courteous. Give your spouse some courtesy. Listen to their mind, to their thoughts, to their words, and give them some space. Verse 9, not rendering evil for evil or railing for railing, but contrariwise blessing. Verse 10, for he that will love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil. Verse 11, let him eschew evil and do good. Let him seek peace. And then I love verse 12. For the eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and his ears are open unto their prayers. What does that mean? That means even God listens to our foolishness at times. Even God listens to us. He cares about everything we say. He doesn't shut us down. He doesn't ignore us. He doesn't tell us we're wrong. He listens to us. We've got to appreciate how our spouse thinks. It should matter. Go back to Esther chapter 4. Esther chapter 7, I think I said 4. Turn to chapter 7, and we'll see, secondly, it matters how they feel. It matters how your wife feels. It matters how your husband feels. It matters how your child feels. In Esther chapter 7, the king has graciously welcomed his wife into his presence. He's heard her request, and the request was to come have a banquet. He and Haman with Esther, and in verse 1 of chapter 7, the king and Haman come to banquet with Esther the queen. And the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed even to the half of the kingdom. In verse 3, Esther answers and says, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Now, I believe when she said that there were tears in her eyes. I believe there was a quiver in her lip. I believe that was emotional. Based on my experience with humanity, the things she says, it was, King, my husband, we've been sold out to die. And if it were just slavery, I wouldn't have said anything. But it's my dad. It's my family. It's my life. Verse 5, Then the king answered and said unto Esther, Who is he? And where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? While Esther is a tremendous example of a spouse taking her spouse's thoughts seriously, Ahasuerus is a tremendous example of a spouse taking his spouse's feelings seriously. I think both husbands and wives do a pretty good job of saying to the other person, your thoughts don't matter. I think both husbands and wives do a good job of telling their spouse your feelings don't matter. However, I think ladies are quicker to think that their husbands are mentally incompetent. And I think husbands are quicker to assume their wives are emotionally unstable. And yet, Ahasuerus, he doesn't accuse his wife of being dramatic. He doesn't accuse his wife of exaggerating. He doesn't tell his wife, oh, hang on there, honey. I can't imagine it's as bad as you say it is. He doesn't say, whoa, easy. We're exaggerating again. We're being dramatic. Turn the tears off. No, his initial, immediate response is, who is he? And where is he that durst presume to do this to you? He took her emotions, her feelings, immediately seriously. And the marital stock he earned from that would do each of us husbands a great deal of good to take it as an example. We ought to take our wives' emotions seriously and immediately seriously and instantaneously seriously. He didn't doubt his wife's sentiments. He didn't downplay her feelings. He didn't forbid emotion. He embraced it. Simply put, it mattered to Esther what her husband thought, and it mattered to Ahasuerus how his wife felt. It mattered to him before he was able to confirm her claims. Husbands, your wife's feelings may be hard for you to understand, but it needs to matter to you. Ladies, I realize it's only once in a blue moon your husband shows emotion, but when he does, do not downplay it. It needs to matter. Parents, your child's feelings may be hard for you to appreciate, but they need to matter to us. If our spouse feels like their feelings don't matter, then they won't feel like they matter. If your spouse feels like their tears don't matter to you, their concerns don't matter to you, their frustrations don't matter to you, then they will feel unwanted, unappreciated, and unloved. Fathers, if your daughter feels like her tears don't matter to you, then they will feel unwanted. Mothers, if your daughter feels like their concerns don't matter to you, then they will feel unappreciated. Test this out in the future, ladies and gentlemen. When your spouse lashes out emotionally, he or she is screaming to be taken seriously. Parents, when your children act out emotionally, either they are emotionally unstable or are probably feeling misunderstood. Now, never do children have a right to be disrespectful, never, for no reason. But children do have a right to express their emotions. Failure to take a child's feelings seriously will result in a failed relationship between parent and child. You know, children need help with their feelings. They need to figure out how to manage them. They need to learn how to rule their spirit. They need to learn how to deal with their anger, their tears, their sorrow, their frustrations with their brother or sister or whatever else they're dealing with. If they can't entrust us with their feelings, they're in trouble, and our relationship with them is in trouble. Simply put, the feelings of our spouse, the feelings of our children, right or wrong, need to matter to us. A whole book of the Bible, the book of Psalms, you think about the book of Psalms, it's a whole book of emotion. It's a whole book of feelings. In fact, for many years I've read through them, and I think to myself, God, why did you put this in your word? It's just one dude complaining to you. Like, there's no doctrinal value to it. This guy's just whining about you and questioning you, and I'm not sure you want that in there, because that puts some seeds into my mind. And God told me, listen, it's because how you feel matters to me. How you feel matters to me. And how our loved ones feel should matter to us. Stay in Esther chapter 7. I want to look briefly at the third thing, and we'll be done. And number 3, it needs to matter why our spouse, why our children, why our family members, why our loved ones fail. Because Ahasuerus' thoughts mattered to Esther, she was received in the inner court with open arms. And because Esther's feelings mattered to Ahasuerus, he was given the benefit of the doubt. Look at her response in verse number 6. This is awesome. I love it. Verse number 6, Esther's going to answer the question, who is he and where is he? Why does he want to do this to you? Esther says, verse 6, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Now that may not mean a whole lot to you, but let's take a step back. And who could Esther have blamed for that law? The king. Who does the buck stop with? Stops with the king. Who gave Haman the ring to make that decree? Who gave Haman the money, the silver, and the gold? Look back in the story and you'll find out it was the king. Who allowed Haman to even propose this? The king. Who's responsible to oversee all the laws, all the decrees? It's the king, her husband. And I wonder, gentlemen, I wonder, ladies, how often in your marriage are you blamed by your spouse exclusively for the problems in life? If we were honest, a lot more than we ought to be. Yeah, her husband made a mistake. Let's not overlook that. He did have to assume responsibility as the king. He failed his wife. He failed the Jewish people. It was an unjust law. He failed the empire for allowing Haman such influence in legislation. But when she answered the question, you know what she did? She gave him the benefit of the doubt, and Esther put the blame where it ultimately belonged, on the man who influenced her husband to allow that to be law. You see, to Esther, it mattered why her husband made the mistake he did. To Esther, it mattered why her husband allowed for such a terrible law. It mattered that he received bad counsel from a bitter man. It mattered that he was tricked into thinking the Jews were rebellious citizens. To Esther, it mattered that her husband was deceived. Simply put, it mattered to Esther why her husband failed. She didn't allow her fear to cloud her judgment. She didn't allow her anger to distract her from the big picture. She placed the blame where it belonged. She was reasonable. She was considerate enough to give her husband the benefit of the doubt, look beyond his decisions and see the root, to see the problem. The problem is Haman, not the king. Husbands, failure is inevitable, but it needs to matter why your wife fails. And wives, failure is inevitable for your husband. It just needs to matter why he failed. Parents, failure is inevitable, but it needs to matter why our children fail. You see, when our loved ones fail, we tend to focus entirely on the failure, don't we? Especially the bigger the failure. And when our spouse tries to explain himself or herself, what do? I don't want to hear it. I don't care about the reasons. You should have known better. And well, when you do that, you don't know it, but you're pushing your spouse away. Oh, he hurt me. Yeah, but you're not even allowing him to explain himself. You're not even allowing her to explain herself. You're telling her that her reasons don't matter. You have all the reasons. You have all the answers. You know everything. You're pushing people away. Pushing people away. When we push people away, we have to confront at that point who is the true offender. Think of your kids, right? You find out your child broke the window and you flip out and they say, but Brian did it. Brian made me do it, or whoever in the family. Jeff did it. I don't care what he did. You shouldn't do that. I'm as guilty as anybody. What I've seen in my parenting years, the harm I do when I strip my child the opportunity to at least explain themselves. When we fail our family members, we will blame others to avoid responsibility, and that's wrong. But there are times when we will put blame where it belongs to explain ourselves, and it needs to matter at that point. It needs to be important to the offended party. We need to ask ourselves, was it really all Ahasuerus' fault, or was Haman the instigator? And then I really beg of you, everyone in this room tonight, and we're almost done, so hang in there. When your loved one fails you, it may be your adult child, it may be your young child, it may be your spouse, it may be your parent, it may be your sibling. Please don't be so self-centered that you won't recognize your level of contribution to your loved one's failure. Now, I've said this before, and maybe it angers some of you, but I think adultery is rarely, if ever, the fault of one party exclusively. I use that example because it's so intimate. But rarely does one person go out and cheat on their spouse because the other person had nothing to do with it. Now, they may be 95% guilty, but are you willing to assume the 5%? To recognize you played a role in it? Galatians chapter 6, don't turn there. Paul says this, brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such an one in the spirit of meekness. Paul says, do that, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. And I understand that means somebody else you're not involved in. They are overtaken in a fault. You want to help them. You want to do so meekly because you might be in their shoes someday. But I'd like to take and apply that verse to a person you love who hurt you. They're overtaken in a fault. You know what we ought to do? Before we go off and just list all these reasons they're a bad person and why they're wrong, let's consider ourselves. Let's consider what role did we play in that. Most problems in the home are not individual problems, they're corporate problems. Especially for a marriage. Marriage indeed is the melting of two people into one. And we as spouses can help or hurt the personality flaws of our spouses. If our spouse has an anger problem, well, we can very easily get that anger problem revved up and then blame them. You're an angry person. Yeah, because she's living with you. Or because he's living with you. We can help or hurt those in our home. If your spouse has a spending problem, well, you can help or hurt that. You absolutely contribute to that. And there are a lot of substance abuses and sinful practices our spouses engage in that we contribute to and need to examine our role in it. Accusing or blaming our loved ones for their failure is easy peasy. It's just easy to do that, right? Anybody can do that. You're a bad person. Are you cultivating intimacy? Are you cultivating a relationship where they feel wanted? No, you're not. Evaluating why our loved ones fail, it's a much better approach. Doing that promotes intimacy. If your spouse makes a terrible decision or is ingrained in this terrible problem, you know how you cultivate a relationship where you can actually help them is sit down with them and say, hey, let's figure this out together. What happened? How did you get to point B? Where's the A? What are the steps that led you to that? Because if I did something wrong, I want to fix it. And if I can help you, then I want to fix that. But let's figure out the reasons, not just accuse and blame you for your failure. This is a tough step to do because we have to not be so self-centered. Greatest example in the Bible, Genesis chapter 16. Genesis chapter 16, Sarah says, I don't have any kids. God hasn't given me any kids anymore. Abraham, take my maid, Hagar. You go in under her, get her pregnant, and then I'll take that child and we'll have children through Hagar. Did she not say that? Oh, she did. Until Hagar gets pregnant and looks at Sarah and despises her. To which Sarah goes to Abraham and says, my wrong be upon you. It's your idea. My wrong be upon you. The Lord judge between me and you. That's what she did. Like, I did what you told me to, and now you're all over my case. Yeah, she didn't acknowledge her role. That was a mistake, by the way. Abraham, big failure, big mistake. You have to assume responsibility for that. You're a big boy. You shouldn't have done that. However, Sarah, this was a corporate mistake, a marital failure. What gall to point at Abraham. My wrong be upon you. You think that promoted a little bit of issue in the marriage? I'm sure it did. It certainly didn't provoke any intimacy with those two people. And so the next time your spouse fails, and there will be a next time, listen to the reason for it. It may be bogus, but it may be legit. The next time your child fails, and there will be a next time, listen carefully to the reason, because it matters. The next time your loved one fails, ask yourself, was it Ahasuerus or was it Haman? Not to let Ahasuerus out the hook, but to put the blame where it belongs. Was it all them? Or is it some of me? Is this all on them? Or did I contribute to this? By pinpointing the real reasons for your loved one's failure, you'll make them feel wanted and loved. And isn't that what we need to do? To preserve, maintain, and ultimately grow the relationships that ought to matter to us most. I said in the introduction, and I'll say it again in closing, it's relatively easy to give someone the impression that they don't mean that much to you. All that needs to be done to give people that impression is just to be self-centered. And so to combat that, it's time to make their thoughts, their feelings, and the reasons why they failed important to you. Simple, not easy to implement on a daily basis, but this is what we're to do. Hey, just because every way of man is right in your own eyes doesn't mean it's right in God's eyes. In fact, the rest of that verse says, but the Lord pondereth the hearts. You do not have a patent on truth, and I and you were never always right. That's why God said two are better than one. Because you need the head, you need the soul, and you need the life of the other people in your lives. Let's have a word of prayer. Stand if you would.